The Wailing Well. It began with the letter. I found it on my doorstep just after sundown, resting unnaturally pristine on the battered welcome mat. There was no return address, no postage, just my name, scrawled in sharp, spidery handwriting that looked more like claw marks than ink. I live alone, far from the bustle of neighbors or townsfolk, so the sight of an uninvited letter filled me with an unease I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But it was a seed of something close to it. Inside was a single piece of parchment. The paper was water-stained, the ink blotchy in places, as though it had soaked through from tears or rain that hadn't quite dried. The message was brief, its tone urgent and cryptic. Come to Hollow's Edge. Midnight by the woods. You are expected. I turned the letter over in my hands, searching for some explanation, some indication of a joke. My heart beat a little faster as I noticed an odd scent rising from the paper. It smelled of earth and something faintly metallic. Blood? I shook my head. Surely not. Hollow's Edge. The name stirred a faint familiarity, but I couldn't place it. A small village, maybe. I wasn't sure I'd ever heard of it before, but even as I considered ignoring the letter, I felt an odd pull in the pit of my stomach. There was something in those words. You are expected. A summons I couldn't deny. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't excitement. It was like being hooked from the inside, drawn toward a place I shouldn't go. I spent the evening trying to distract myself, but the letter sat on the kitchen table like an accusation, daring me to act. By 10 o'clock, I could no longer resist. Grabbing a coat and scarf, I stuffed the letter into my pocket and set off in my car, its old engine groaning awake against the night stillness. I didn't even check a map. I simply drove as though the road already knew where to take me. The trip was longer than I expected. Hollow's Edge lay nestled in a forgotten pocket of countryside I would have sworn didn't exist. As I left the highway and turned onto winding back roads, the air grew colder, the night pressing heavier against the car. The trees grew taller and more twisted the further I went, their gnarled branches reaching over the road like blackened fingers. My headlights pierced the dark only barely, the mist rising in thin, ghostly tendrils that licked the edges of the windshield. By the time I reached the village, my fuel gauge hovered ominously close to empty, though I'd filled it that morning. Hollow's Edge appeared like a secret whisper to the dark, small, silent, and dimly lit. Stone houses with sagging roofs lined the main road, their shutters closed like wary eyes. I saw no movement, no lights in the windows. It was as though the village were holding its breath. I parked near what looked like an abandoned church. Its steeple loomed crookedly against the night sky, and the bell, black with age, hung motionless. My breath misted as I stepped out of the car, the cold sinking into my bones despite my coat. An unnatural silence enveloped everything, so thick and heavy it swallowed the sound of my footsteps as I walked toward the faint glow of a nearby lantern. Midnight by the woods, I whispered aloud, the words sounding foolish now that I was here. What woods? Which direction? I scanned the village for any sign of life, but the few streets were empty. Then I saw him, a figure just beyond the edge of the lantern's light. Small, thin, dressed in a too large coat and cap. He stood perfectly still, his face turned toward me, though I couldn't make out the features. My heart stuttered. "Hello?" I called. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer. "I'm looking for..." I stopped myself. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. "Do you know where I'm expected to go?" Slowly, the figure raised one arm and pointed. Down the narrowest street in the village, where the buildings crumbled into shadow. The road led into the trees, their shapes darker than the sky behind them, as though they were swallowing the light. "Thank you," I managed, though the words felt absurdly out of place. The boy, or what I assumed was a boy, lowered his arm but didn't speak. I shivered as I passed him, his stillness lingering behind me like a shadow. I didn't dare turn back to look at him again. Instead, I pressed on, following the dirt path that curled into the blackness of the woods. The forest was alive in ways that felt wrong. Though there was no wind, the branches above me creaked and groaned as though protesting my presence. The air had a weight to it, heavy and thick with a smell like stagnant water. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard faint sobbing, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to rise and fall with my heartbeat. I stopped, straining to listen, but the noise vanished. The path narrowed. The trees leaned closer together, and I felt sure they were watching me. Twice, I thought I saw movement between the trunks, quick, darting shapes that vanished when I turned to look. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the dark, my mind playing games. Then I saw it. A clearing opened before me, and at its center sat a well. The structure was ancient, its stone walls crumbling and cracked. Moss grew thickly between the stones, and long, spindly roots wound around its base like skeletal fingers. The well's mouth yawned wide and black, as though it might swallow the night itself. I didn't know why, but the sight of it filled me with a primal dread. My pulse quickened, and I felt lightheaded, as though the very air here was tainted. Then I heard it again. The sobbing. It rose from within the well, muffled and distant but unmistakable. It wasn't the sob of a single person. It was a chorus of sorrow, dozens of voices layered together in a harmony of anguish. My throat tightened, and for a long moment I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It's just the wind, I thought desperately. It's the wind rushing through the stones. But it wasn't. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. I felt the sound. Those cries, seeping into my bones, burrowing into my chest like worms in soft earth. I took a step back, my hands trembling. "Hello?" I whispered. The sobbing stopped. Silence fell, heavier than before. Then, from deep within the well, a sound rose to meet me. A voice. It was a whisper, so soft I almost couldn't hear it, but it carried a terrible clarity that made my blood run cold. "You are expected." My heart slammed against my ribs. I stumbled backward, the world tilting as I scrambled away from the well. My feet caught on a root, and I fell hard onto the cold ground. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself up, my eyes fixed on the black mouth of the well. The whisper came again, louder this time, as though rising to follow me. "You are expected." I turned and ran. I didn't look back. The path seemed longer now, the trees more twisted and hostile. The air buzzed with a noise I couldn't name, and the sobbing returned louder and closer with each step. By the time I reached the village again, my chest burned and my vision blurred. The figure, the boy, was gone. The streets were still empty, the church steeple looming silently above me. In the distance, somewhere deep within the forest, the sobbing continued, and it was coming for me. I didn't sleep that night. Back at the crumbling inn, I sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, my back pressed into the cold wall as though it could shield me. The window shutters rattled in a phantom wind, and the sound of the well, the cries, had followed me here. It started as faint whispers, like voices carried on a breeze, but by midnight, it grew into something relentless. It wasn't just crying anymore. It was pleading. "Help us! Let us out!" And worst of all, I heard my own name whispered in their fractured voices. My throat was dry as I clutched the letter that had brought me here. The ink had smudged further, bleeding across the paper like veins. I thought of leaving, of running to my car and driving until I forgot this place. But the pull of that well held me like invisible strings. It wanted me, expected me, and I knew deep down that I couldn't leave. Not yet. Around 3 a.m, a knock echoed through my room. Soft, rhythmic. 3 slow taps. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The innkeeper had been clear when he showed me to my room. "No one comes here after dark. Don't answer your door." Yet the knocking came again, louder this time, each tap like a nail driven into my mind. I rose to my feet, the floor creaking under me as I approached the door. "Who's there?" I whispered. Silence. I placed my hand on the door handle, the metal cold beneath my skin. For a moment I hesitated, but something beyond my control urged me forward. Slowly I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The lanterns lining the walls had burned out and only darkness greeted me. But as I turned to close the door, I saw it. Muddy footprints trailing from the forest, leading directly to my room. They were large and uneven, as if something heavy had dragged itself step by step. I slammed the door shut, bolting it behind me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, the innkeeper found me in the same chair, clutching my knees to my chest. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You heard it, didn't you?" he said softly. I nodded, my throat tight. "The well. It's real. It's alive." He sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "That well has been cursed for longer than anyone can remember. It's older than this village, older than the trees. It's a wound on this land that never healed." "Why does it call to people?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He looked at me, his face pale and worn. "The well is a door that was never meant to be opened. It feeds on souls, on people foolish enough to listen to its cries. Once you've heard them, you're marked. You'll hear them until they drag you back." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. There must be a way to stop it. The innkeeper hesitated. "Some say there's a way, a ritual performed at the edge of the well. But no one who's tried has ever returned. If you're smart, you'll leave now. Get as far from this place as you can." "I can't leave," I said quietly. "It won't let me." And I knew it was true. The cries were already inside me, echoing in my mind like a broken record. They weren't just something I heard. They were something I felt. A cold, gnawing presence that dug deeper with every hour. If I didn't face the well, it would consume me. That afternoon, I returned to the forest. The trees seemed darker this time, their branches twisting unnaturally above me. The path I'd taken the night before had changed, winding in ways that didn't make sense, as though the forest itself was trying to confuse me. I could hear the faint sobbing growing louder with each step, calling me deeper. Finally, I reached the clearing. The well looked worse in daylight. The stones were darker than I remembered, slick with moisture that smelled of decay. Long, gnarled roots snaked around its base like black veins, and the air around it seemed thicker, as though the very ground was holding its breath. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the cries pulled me forward, their tones desperate and human. I peered into the well's mouth, its darkness absolute. "Is anyone down there?" I whispered. The cries stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a voice rose from the blackness, soft, ragged, and chillingly clear. "We see you." A cold wind whipped through the clearing and I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I turned to flee, the ground beneath me trembled. The well was breathing. Inhale, exhale. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears as the cries erupted again, louder than ever before. They surrounded me, filling my mind with their anguish. Faces flashed in my vision, pale, hollow-eyed figures reaching for me from the darkness. I saw men, women, and children, all dragged into the earth, their mouths twisted in silent screams. And then I heard it, my own voice among the cries. "Come back." I stumbled to my feet, the sound of my own pleas ringing in my ears. The well was no longer just a structure. It was a mouth, and it was hungry. Roots began to twist and writhe, slithering toward me across the ground like serpents. I ran, crashing through the forest as branches clawed at my face and arms. The cries followed me all the way back to the village. When I returned to the inn, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The innkeeper stood over me, his face shadowed in the dim light. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "It's alive," I whispered. "It's awake." He nodded, his expression grim. "And it won't stop now. Not until it's had what it wants." "What does it want?" The innkeeper didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the floor. I looked down and felt my blood run cold. Muddy footprints, the same ones I'd seen outside my door last night, trailed across the wooden floorboards, leading straight to where I stood. They weren't mine. That night, I barricaded myself in my room. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The cries were louder now, closer, as if the well itself had followed me. I could hear it in the walls, in the floors, in my veins. I'm running out of time. Tomorrow I'll go back. I'll perform the ritual, whatever it takes to silence the voices, to close the door. But I'm afraid, because every time I close my eyes, I see the well, and it's waiting for me. That night, I dreamed of the well. I was standing at its edge again, the forest shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the earth itself was pressing down on me. The well's gaping mouth yawned wide, deeper and blacker than before, and the cries had changed. They were no longer distant. They were close, rising from just below the surface. I leaned over, compelled to look inside. What I saw still haunts me. The faces, so many faces, stared up at me from the abyss. Their eyes were empty sockets, their mouths twisted wide as they screamed in silence. They floated like specters in the darkness, their pale, decaying hands reaching upward as if begging for release. And then, among the writhing mass of tortured souls, I saw my own face. It stared back at me, its mouth whispering a single word. "Join us." I awoke with a scream, drenched in sweat, the cries still echoing in my ears. My room was freezing, the frost on the window thicker than before. I glanced toward the floor and froze. The footprints were back, muddy and wet, but this time they led from my bed, as though something had stood there watching me sleep. I couldn't take it anymore. The curse was tightening around me like a noose, each hour pulling me closer to the edge. The cries weren't just in the well anymore. They were in my mind, whispering to me every moment of the day, urging me to return. I had to end this. I had to face the well, no matter the cost. The innkeeper was waiting for me downstairs. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and sunken, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a steaming cup of tea in front of me. "You look worse," he muttered. "I don't have much time left," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Tell me about the ritual. You know something." The innkeeper's gaze flickered to the window. Outside, the fog was thicker now, swallowing the village whole. It was as though the forest was creeping closer, inch by inch. After a long pause, he sighed deeply. "Long ago, there was a priest, Father Alwyn, who tried to seal the well. He learned that the cries belonged to those who were sacrificed to it centuries ago. Some say it's a gate, a door to something dark and hungry. The only way to stop it is to offer it something it cannot take by force." "What does that mean?" I demanded, though deep down I already knew. The innkeeper met my gaze, his expression hard. "A willing soul. The well feeds on fear and despair, but if someone goes to it willingly, their sacrifice can seal it, at least for a time." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "And if no one does?" He shook his head. "Then it will spread. The cries will call to others. One by one, it will consume us all." Armed with nothing but an oil lantern and a journal I'd borrowed from the innkeeper, a tattered tome containing Father Alwyn's writings, I made my way back to the forest. This time the path was clear, as if the well itself was expecting me. The trees bent inward, their branches forming an archway that guided me toward the clearing. The cries had grown louder now, no longer sorrowful but eager, like a chorus of voices welcoming me home. The well was waiting. Its stones glistened with moisture, and its roots had spread further, writhing like living things. The air around it pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, and as I stepped closer, the cries crescendoed into a deafening wail. The faces from my dream flashed in my mind, and I felt them watching me from the depths below. I opened the journal, flipping to the page that described the ritual. The steps were simple but terrifying. A spoken incantation, an offering of blood, and the final act, a choice made willingly. My hands trembled as I lit the lantern, its orange glow casting grotesque shadows across the clearing. As I recited the words, the earth beneath me began to shake. Through the cries of the lost, I sealed the wound. Through the blood of the willing, I closed the door. Let this well be silenced. Let the dead rest once more. I took the knife I'd brought, an old, rusted thing I'd found at the inn, and pressed the blade against my palm. The metal was ice cold, and I hissed through my teeth as I dragged it across my skin. Blood welled up, dark and warm, dripping onto the stones of the well. The cries fell silent. For one terrible moment, the clearing was completely still. The air felt thicker, charged with something unnatural. Then a sound rose from deep within the well, a rumbling, wet gurgle that grew louder and louder, until it was a roar that shook the ground beneath my feet. The faces appeared again, but this time they were climbing. Clawing, hands, pale and skeletal, emerged from the well's mouth, grasping the edges as if to pull themselves free. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, and their mouths opened wide, their silent screams twisting into a sound that wasn't human. I stumbled back, the knife slipping from my grip, my mind screaming at me to run. "We see you!" The whisper echoed through the clearing, though it came from everywhere. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the voices grew louder, each one a fragment of someone long dead. "Help us! Take my place. Let us out." And then I understood. The well didn't want my blood. It wanted me. The ritual demanded a willing soul, but the voices were trying to break me, to make me surrender willingly, to join them. I clamped my hands over my ears, screaming into the dark. "I won't! I won't!" But even as I shouted, I felt the pull in my chest, a weight dragging me toward the well's edge. My body was no longer my own, my feet sliding forward as the cries grew triumphant, their wails twisting into something almost like laughter. I dug my fingers into the earth, tears streaming down my face. I won't. The faces were almost free now, their hands clawing at the roots, their mouths stretched open in anticipation. I was seconds away from slipping over the edge when I remembered the final line of Father Alwyn's journal. "The well cannot claim what does not fear it." It was a lie, a trick. The well fed on fear, and in that moment I realized I had to fight it, not with strength, but with resolve. I forced myself to stand, staring into the darkness below, and screamed with everything I had. "You can't have me!" The wails faltered, their harmony shattering into discordant shrieks. The hands recoiled, clawing at the stones as though in agony. The air around me grew colder, sharper, and the ground shook violently as the well began to collapse. "Be silent!" I screamed again, my voice echoing across the clearing. And then, just like that, the cries stopped. The silence was deafening. I stumbled back as the ground gave one final shudder. The well's mouth crumbled inward, the roots curling like dying limbs. Dust and debris filled the air, and for the first time I heard nothing but my own ragged breathing. It was over. By the time I staggered back to the village, dawn was breaking. The fog had lifted, and the forest was quiet once more. The innkeeper met me at the edge of town, his eyes wide as he took in my bloodied hand and dirt-streaked face. "Did you?" I nodded, though I couldn't bring myself to speak. The cries were gone. For now. But as I left Hollow's Edge later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. The well was gone, but its memory lingered, like an echo waiting to rise again. And sometimes when the night is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. A faint cry, calling my name. The forest swallowed me whole. The path that led to the clearing seemed longer this time, distorted, as though the woods were stretching themselves, buying time. The trees loomed taller, twisted branches interlocking like gnarled fingers above my head. The air was colder now, sharp and metallic, and each breath felt like inhaling splinters of ice. The light was fading fast, though I'd left in the early afternoon. It was as if the sun itself refused to witness what was about to happen. In my hand, I gripped an old leather journal, its spine cracked, its pages stained. I'd found it in the innkeeper's cellar, buried beneath dusty bottles and forgotten boxes. It belonged to Father Edmund, a priest who had vanished over a century ago, one of many victims claimed by the Wailing Well. His scrawled words spoke of a ritual, an offering meant to close the door and silence the voices. But the entries were fractured, incomplete, as though he had been interrupted in his final moments. Blood must touch stone. A voice for a voice. I had no idea what those cryptic words meant, but they were all I had. I wasn't going to let the well take me, not without a fight. The sobbing began long before I reached the clearing. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze like distant cries of a morning choir. With every step it grew louder, more anguished. My name wove itself into the wails, hissed and drawn out like a plea. Come back to us. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself forward. I couldn't let it in. I couldn't let it take me. Finally, I stumbled into the clearing. The well stood at its center, ancient and rotten, its stones blackened and slick as though they were sweating oil. The roots coiled tighter around its base now, writhing slowly, like muscles beneath skin. I could feel its presence, its hunger, as though the well itself were alive, pulsing with unseen veins that ran deep into the earth. The moment I stepped closer, the cries stopped. Silence fell over the clearing, absolute and suffocating. The forest seemed to freeze around me, and even the air held still. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence, as I stared into the yawning black mouth of the well. Let this work, I whispered, my voice small. I pulled out the items I'd brought for the ritual, a vial of my own blood, drawn shakily with a rusted needle I'd found in the inn, a scrap of cloth I'd torn from my shirt, and a candle that sputtered weakly in the breeze. I lit the candle and placed it carefully on the edge of the well. The journal's words ran through my mind, disjointed and cryptic. Blood must touch stone. With trembling hands, I uncorked the vial and tipped it over the lip of the well. The blood splattered onto the stone, unnaturally dark against the slick surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on. Then I heard it. A sound like rushing wind rising from the depths. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the movement of air or water, but something alive, clawing its way up from the darkness. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew colder still, like an open grave. I staggered back, my candle flickering violently before it went out. The wails began again, louder now as though the well itself were screaming. I fell to my knees, clapping my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The cries pierced straight through me, vibrating in my bones, filling my mind with images, faces twisted in agony, mouths stretched wide in eternal screams. Stop! I screamed into the void. The well answered. A hand shot out from the darkness, pale and skeletal, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with black nails. It gripped the edge of the stone, pulling with slow, deliberate strength. Another hand followed, then the top of a head, slick and hollow, emerging inch by inch. Its face was smooth and wrong, devoid of features except for a mouth, gaping open far too wide, as though it could swallow me whole. I scrambled backward, my breath ragged as the figure continued to rise from the well. Its body was gaunt, bones pressing against thin, gray skin that glistened like it was soaked in oil. Its chest expanded and contracted in slow, unnatural movements, as though it were taking its first breaths in centuries. It stopped moving, its its face, or what passed for a face, turning toward me. I couldn't look away. The mouth twitched as though trying to form words. Then, in a voice that echoed with 1,000 overlapping whispers, it spoke. "You are ours." My body seized, my muscles locking as if held by invisible strings. I felt it then, the well's presence reaching into me, wrapping around my mind like icy tendrils. Images flashed through my head in a sickening blur. Children standing at the edge of the well, staring blankly into the darkness. A woman screaming as roots coiled around her ankles, pulling her into the earth. Faces half buried in stone, their mouths still crying for mercy. It wanted me to join them. "A voice for a voice," I whispered, my lips trembling. The creature paused, its head tilting unnaturally. I didn't know if it understood me, but I seized the moment. My shaking hands found the journal, its pages flapping wildly in the freezing wind. I held it up, my voice rising above the screams. "I give you my voice! Take it and leave me be!" The figure shuddered violently, its body convulsing as though it were writhing against invisible chains. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and the cries of the well grew deafening, a chorus of thousands of souls wailing as one. Blood trickled from my ears, my vision blurred, but I didn't stop. "I give you my voice! Take it!" The figure let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but something worse, a deep guttural roar that shook the earth. The roots around the well snapped, writhing like snakes before pulling back into the ground. The figure sank slowly into the darkness, its mouth still open, its cries fading into nothing. And then, just like that, it was over. The forest fell silent again. The clearing was still. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know how long I lay there. When I finally opened my eyes, the well was quiet. The stones were cold and lifeless, as though nothing had ever happened. The air smelled of earth and rain, and for the first time since arriving in Hollow's Edge, I felt alone. The whispers were gone. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak beneath me. The forest path was waiting, clear and unchanging. I turned my back on the well and walked away, the silence of the woods pressing in around me. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I never should have turned my back on the well. The path back through the forest was longer than I remembered, the silence around me wrong, an absence of sound that pressed down like a physical weight. I heard no birds, no rustling leaves, only my shallow breaths and the crunch of my boots on the cold, damp earth. The air felt heavier the further I walked, as if the forest itself were watching. My footsteps slowed, an awful realization dawning on me. The path was changing. The trees, tall and twisted, moved when I wasn't looking. I would glance away for a moment, only to find a gnarled trunk now looming closer, roots slithering across the ground like veins. Every direction looked the same, dark, impenetrable, and though I felt I was moving forward, the path ahead twisted endlessly into shadow. Behind me, the faintest sound began to stir. A whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was soft at first, carried on a breeze that I hadn't noticed before, a sound like weeping. My blood ran cold as I turned back toward the clearing, now hidden by thick trees. The whisper became louder, layered with voices that dragged at the edge of my mind, familiar and alien all at once. "Don't leave us. Come back." I stepped backward, my pulse thundering in my ears. The whispers coiled around me, slithering into my thoughts, threading through my bones. As I turned to run, the earth beneath me shifted, the roots pulsing like veins in diseased flesh. I stumbled, hands scraping against the damp soil, my head ringing with cries that weren't my own. When I looked up, the trees had parted. I was back at the well. Its stones gleamed wetly, slick with blood that oozed from cracks in the stone. The air around it shimmered with something wrong, a a faint humming that vibrated in my chest. And then, from deep within the darkness, it spoke. "You can't leave." The voice was different now. Deeper, heavier, as though the well itself had grown stronger, fed by my terror. The earth beneath me trembled again, and I watched in frozen horror as the roots began to move, slowly, deliberately, like fingers flexing beneath skin. "You promised us a voice," it said, the words scraping against my mind. "We want more." A noise broke the air, a cry, shrill and raw, like the wail of something not meant to exist. I staggered back as figures began to crawl from the well. One by one they emerged, their bodies slick and pale, their mouths stretched into silent screams. Their eyes were hollow, deep pits of shadow, and yet I felt their gazes on me. Empty, accusing, hungry. They moved in jerks and spasms, pulling themselves out of the well with trembling hands that left trails of blood across the stones. The air grew thick, foul, and I tasted something bitter at the back of my throat. "Join us." The words echoed from all directions now, a chorus of hollow voices that rose and fell like the tide. My head pounded, my vision blurred. The forest around me tilted, the sky above me darkened, and the figures dragged themselves closer, hands outstretched, fingers curling like claws. I turned to flee, but the roots surged upward, twisting around my ankles, pulling me toward the well's yawning mouth. The figures surrounded me now, their hands cold as they grabbed my arms, their mouths moving soundlessly. I screamed, my voice ragged and desperate, but it was swallowed by the wails that erupted from the well, an endless cacophony that consumed everything. This is where it ends, I thought, my mind fracturing under the pressure of their cries. This is where I will disappear. Then, something shifted. A memory. Father Edmund's words in the journal, barely legible but suddenly clear. A voice for a voice. Silence its call, or it will take you whole. Summoning every ounce of will left in my breaking body, I twisted free of the figures and lunged toward the well's edge. My hands closed around the cold, slick stones, and I leaned over the mouth of the abyss, my voice raw and trembling. "Take it!" I screamed. "Take my voice and let me go!" For a moment, the world stopped. The figures froze. The roots stilled. Even the cries from the well seemed to falter, the wails dipping into silence like a held breath. The blackness inside the well pulsed once, twice, and then shattered into a deafening roar. I felt it leave me then. My voice, torn from my throat like a thread pulled taut. My scream died mid-breath, replaced by silence so complete it rang in my ears. The figures collapsed back into the earth, their bodies disintegrating into dust as the roots slithered away. The well went still. I staggered back, gasping though no sound escaped my mouth. My throat burned, raw and empty, but the forest around me had fallen silent. Even the trees seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the clearing brightened slightly, the darkness loosening its grip. I didn't look back. When I stumbled out of the forest hours later, the village of Hollow's Edge was quiet, its streets empty as if it had never existed at all. I left my car behind, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the cobbled streets as I walked into the mist. I never returned to Hollow's Edge. I don't think I could find it again if I tried. But the silence remains, following me wherever I go. I haven't spoken since that night, not a word. I gave my voice to the well, but sometimes, when the wind is still, I can hear it whispering my name. And I know, deep down, that the well is still waiting. It always waits.